Всем привет, коллеги, я думаю.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think, colleagues, we can start. I think I want to start a small introduction. Has it ever happened with you that in the project you had a huge number of huge pile of text that were written by at some point by some people, but using the language that it's impossible to debug? I can see the people who understands me. Did it ever happen that the developers did not write component tests because of which you couldn't automate all the tests? Had to spend more time on automation. This was the problem that our team faced 2 years ago, and when I came to the project, my task was to solve the problem. My name is Liliya Sapurina. I introduced the company Deutsche Bank. I've been in automation for about 4 years. My major specialty is the creation of automation system from scratch, their support and process stabilization. Last year, I told you how, based on the risk theory analysis of how to use new techniques, and using this algorithm, we concluded that we should actually move to the new approaches. Today, I wanted to share with you the detailed implementation of the tools that we used for this. Here's what we're going to talk about today. In short, I'll tell you how we used Java for automation tool. Then I will give examples of synthetic and logical improvements that we arrived at when writing the test. The second part will be dedicated to the mechanism of writing and testing code in multiple environments, and also told you about problems when we use this selenide features and the experience of moving from 4th to 5th JUnit. So what was the problem that our team faced? At the time, we used two automation tools, Ruby and Protractor, used written in JavaScript. In the Ruby, we wrote different instrument. First thing we wanted to get from the automation instrument is the join used by the developers and the testers. In other words, we wanted to involve the developers into writing component tests so that we could use their page objects in our test. In our team, all the people were using the regular apps and programs for this. Since the developers don't use the Ruby in their daily life, their competence was not enough for quality automation using this language. The protector was used in JavaScript, so we didn't have this problem. And since we used the general criteria, the protector won. Then we started working on the business apps for the banks, and our task was to allow the third-party teams to give additional methods so they concentrate only automation of the internal logics of the application, and other approaches were given to them as the ready-made packages or libraries. Ruby is difficult to integrate in other languages. Therefore, it lost based on this criteria. But as I mentioned before, our apps and has the app, web and desktop version. Therefore, we need to use all the available technologies that we have. Protractor was losing to Ruby since it's written in JavaScript, and as well known, it's difficult to debug the JavaScript. So we spent a lot of time on such tests. Thus, in exploring our approaches, we came to the conclusion they both have a number of disadvantages. Thus, as an instrument for automation, we decided to use the most popular at the time language in the company that did not possess those disadvantages. We use it at Java JUnit with the Selenide, currently developed actually popularly used framework, and a JUnit. The same one framework was not enough. We needed to come up with a syntaxes and architecture so that it would be easy to write not only to the testers but only to developers of different teams. Here I give you examples of basic syntax and logics approaches that allowed us to simplify the project. The first thing we wanted to do is to have the three-layer architecture. First is the page block, the minimal structure of the page, which has this minimal amount of identifier. Then comes the page object and the step. We separate them in terms of functionality. Here I can talking only about the web testing, because for the desktop or server testing we were happy with the step enough, step only. I'll give you an example of page block. If we look closer, we'll see three blocks: as a header, main content, and the cookie. It's important to note two things here. The cookie part is not linked to any concrete page. It can be opened in any other page. Besides, the content block can be divided into smaller parts to get away from the rolling to the scrolling approach. For page block, you need to define its main identifier, for example, the header case. Then you need to enumerate the case objects that will be searched for by this block, and combine them in a certain logic, which is happening in this part of the page. Then, when all the made blocks are ready, the page object describes one concrete page and only it. To implement it, you need to mention all the page blocks that they consist of, and then combine the logic into concrete actions in this page. Next level of abstraction that we came up with is the step. Here we divide them in terms of functionality. Consequently, here we use the functionality pages and the steps. We call the steps token page, so that our text would be perceived as a regular text. It's easy to make this test out of the steps. We don't use framework Cucumber for this. After testing the structure, we understood that it has a number of drawbacks. First, for testing, sometimes we only need step offs and page blocks. For example, for a calculator doesn't have any pages or page objects, are superfluous. Also, it could happen that page object has such a trivial logic that adding an abstraction layer is unwarranted. Also, some scenarios contain go-through check of functionality. Thus, it happens in the check step class. We have a number of notions that are easily to get lost in. Of course, we can be guided by the cost fix page and describe what we mean by block pages or step. But sometimes the names are too big, or sooner or later somebody will forget about the postfix and it will be difficult to figure out what is what. The second problem was when we decided to use the steps in one another. Let's see an example. We have a class of the program steps and ticket buying class. And in the first step, we needed to use both elements in the both programs. So we decided to understand and to discuss what will happen here. I mean, I want everyone to wake up here. We'll have. I can hear somebody of you mention it. What kind of exception will that be? Exactly. I know who will get the T-shirts. Great. Here we have a so-called cyclical dependency. Thus, by creating the first class object, we'll move into the creation of the second object class. So it will be a cycle until we have a Stack Overflow exception. We need to decide on this. In our project, we decided to implement the dependency injection feature. The dependency injection feature is a very popular feature in Spring, a framework actively used by our team members. While using it, the object gives the the dependency to special mechanism, outside mechanism. Thus, in a test, we don't need to manually create object. It's enough to mention the annotation. For example, a page block or page object. The creation logic will be written down in a methodology that will define. Thus, the Pokemon problem looks like this. We definitely know now that the last object is a first step. As to the second problem, let's look at the example on the screen. While implementing the injection public, we use the single tone, but the pattern is created in our system only once. Thus, we call the program step, we add them to the cache, since we have already started working on them. Then in the program step, we can see a link to the steps, a link to the purchase of the tickets. We move to them and also add them to the cache because we have been working on them already. While looking at the program steps, we understand they're already in the cache. Thus, we can easily create an object connected with the ticket purchase. But instead of the program step, it will only have a link to the cache. Now we're going back to the program steps, we create them, and thus every object created only once. Our stack flow is not a problem for us. Besides those features, we implemented rules in order to support our three-layer structure, in order to, for case of misprint, or putting a step inside a print object, or page object inside the print block. This case, we'll get error message. On the slide, you don't have all the valid or invalid rules, but just several of them. The dependency injection brought us closer to the declarative approach, unlike in the case of the declarative, we write on how and not why. Also, we moved closer to the SMK syntax that our developers like. The test creation became to them more intuitive, more pleasant. The next improvement idea came to us when we were writing this test with a number of testable users. In other words, the test where we use the login and logout methodology. As you can see from the screen, these methods, they put a lot of extra elements in the code, and at some point it may result in a mistake. Thus, for every application, we decided to create our own authentication method that uses as a parameter of the end-user the activities that can be done and signed in by this user. Thus, our code with a huge number of login and logout becomes a very nice and neat-looking number of constructs. In terms of, since in majority of cases the password doesn't affect the tests, we set the same password for majority of users. Of course, there are some emergency situations and specific situations. For them, we put the passwords in the integration files. Anyway, the algorithm of the password looks the following. First, we check whether we have our current user. Then we check the JVM variable, in other words, the command line. And if it's not, the password is not here, we look at the global variable. The important task for us would be to support the proper work with databases. Of course, the first thing you need to do in such test is to initialize the environment and to close them down in terms of test. But we didn't want to write down the initialization in every test. Also, since there could be a huge number there could be too many repeats, we decided to implement the mechanism that allows us to put the initialize and finalize actions for the whole model. We implemented these using these two simple interfaces. To initialize activity, you need to test the UI initialize, and to finalize, you need to terminate. Use the terminator. Thus, it's all automated. You do not need to write anything. How is it done under the hood? To implement it, we use the service loader. It's a mechanism that allows us to single out the classes based on a number of criteria. For example, the classes that implement a certain user interface. Thus, in the test panel before you run all the tests, we looked for classes and we call for load the service loader. We launch the logic inside of them and then move to the test. Consequently, after the test, we set this. Let's call the service loader, looking for those terminating clauses and use the logic inside of them. Of course, this approach is applied not only in the database, but also it's very convenient for putting out some number of text messages, and login also can be used to log in some flags to turn on or off functionality.
It's a great approach. As for custom web elements, we decided to create custom clusters. And to do so, you just need to increase such elements, either describe custom methods or rewrite them. And then our object will have all the methods of work with the web element, and in addition to that, some customizations. One more idea, a mechanism of page block conversion into each other. Once again, let's have a look at SQA Days web page. Here are the icons of the previous conferences. They are all identical to each other. It doesn't make sense to write page blocks for each of them. That's why I decided to represent the whole list as a separate page block with certain basic methods, calculation of icons, index, and so on, and the return of icon on the basis of index will be done like that. So here you have a title, pushing, and so on. To describe everything, you need just to take two page blocks that are easily converted into each other. And one more JUnit improvement is related to listener and allure. Listener is an object that listens to the code and implements it depending on different events. So it is constantly waiting for something till an event happens in the object where it is registered. Then it receives steering management and can take actions. It's logical that if we have a beginning and the end of the test, it should be informed to the listener. Before the test started, test passed, after test started, finished, and so on. It's an additional customization. So here we have attached performance logs, screenshots, a lot of various things. Let us have a look at simple example. HTML code on the page. If it is there in the test, it means that in case of mistake, HTML code of the page will be added to the mistake report. To do so, you need to extend the standard JUnit code and describe the event. In this case, it's a test failure. Then you check if the annotation in our test, if it is there, you need to additionally check a web driver, because it can be either a server test and then there will be no HTML attachments. If both conditions are fulfilled, with the help of standard allure class, you can attach allure HTML report to the general report. Allure, if you don't know what it is, it's an instrument of Yandex company with the help of which you can develop graphs about auto tests. And now we have a new part of it, steps. Allure listeners can listen to beginning and end of step, and you can use your custom logics at each event. Thanks to such listeners, we added additional login. At the beginning and end of such steps, there is a log, and you can act at each step. Sometimes it's really useful if you want to check what happened before the mistake, step by step, in the form of pictures, what happened to your system. Syntactic and logical improvements, have finished. It's easy to implement them, and they make the test writing much easier. Now I want to tell you about multi-environment testing. What is it? In our project, we use a lot of test environments. Prod, QA, dev, pre-prod environments, and we didn't want it to be related to any specific environment. We wanted the variables to be automatically inserted in our code depending on what environment we are in. So for that purpose, we developed a library. It's an open source. Here you can see a link to the library. The author of the project is Sergey Budnik. In the right you can see his picture. You can find his contact information. If you have any proposals or any questions to him, please feel free to contact him. So let's go to the main page of SQA Days. We have two languages, English and Russian, and in both web pages the curls are different. Let's imagine that we want to test various users at various languages, and we want the data to be inserted automatically. For them to be inserted automatically depending on the environment, you need to describe the environment, of course. So for that purpose, you use smart config dimensions file. Two main notions here, space and points. In space, you describe all possible environments, prod in our case, because we know only prod SQA codes, but in reality it can be test, UAT, and whatever you have in your project. And localities, namely English or Russian. In reality, there might be more spaces. For example, in our project, we have such spaces zone. It can be internal or external. If an application can be launched only inside of the banking system or externally as well. Second notion, points, all possible combinations of spaces. Usually they are listed separately because some spaces might not be combined with others. But if like in other case, you can create all possible combinations, you can use this feature. Then you describe test data. Once again, depending on the environment, local, English or Russian, you have different postfixes in our endpoints and various test users and any test data. Then on the way to such configs, you can use conf files, plugins, and so on. You can go to the web page and check everything, and then when you bring the project together, our Smart and Fix plugin automatically creates as many classes, as many endpoints as you mentioned at the beginning, and in each class there will be a set of heterogeneous factors. So get URL and get for users in test. Then you don't have to use a specific data, you just use your GAT files that are used according to environmental variables. How to use these variables is a philosophical question. You can take it from variable integration, from JVM variables. You can take it and put it inside of the code in the form of some configurations, use environmental variables. It's all up to you. So it's up to automatizer to decide. We managed to simplify our configs. You only need to have a configuration file, which is basic, and then use it in other configuration files. This example with endpoints transformed into simple 3 lines. But not everything was so perfect in our process. And the third thing I want to share with you about the new CNIT features. In our project, as I told you, we develop a platform for the launch of bank applications. In desktop version, it looks like that. The application starts in some kind of container where there's a browser, for example, Chrome. And depending on the application, you might have different versions of Chromiums. And for each Chromium, you need to create a driver with its own version so that they can be connected between each other. So we had a lot of tests that we needed to start in various applications at various chromiums, and we had to implement the logic on downloading and identifying the right version of data of driver, connection to the window, and work with that. We started with that difficult job. It was really not simple. We implemented the customized logics. We covered everything, but we were really surprised that in the last version of Slinid, the multi-driver function was implemented. Transition was also not easy for us because many tests were already related to such customized functionality. That's why we had to work a lot to cancel what we have already written, to insert what we haven't written yet. It was difficult. What are the conclusions we can draw? First, do not create such crutches. We could just wait till appropriate decisions come up on the market, and you need to monitor all the novels. For example, we didn't know about the new thing. And the last problem could be a topic for the whole presentation. It's a sad story about our transition to JUnit 5. At the beginning of our project, we used JUnit 4 because the fifth JUnit was not widely used back then. It was not stable, and there was no plugin for the integration with LU. Was critical for us. That's why we started to use JUnit 4 run. In JUnit 4 run, all the logics is inside of the runner. To change it, you have just a few mechanisms. Of course, there are mechanisms that I talked to you about, but they don't really change the logics of the test. They add additional actions like reporting, logging, or whatever. And there are test rules that really change the test logics. On the slide, for example, you can see an example of error collector that changes the logs of our sorter. The test doesn't fail at the beginning, it goes till the end, and at the end shows all the mistakes. But the problem with test rules is that you need to announce them inside of the test. You cannot announce the rules beforehand. That's why, as a matter of fact, test rules changes the logics only of the test you are doing right now, which is not really convenient. In order to add additional logics to polarization of tests or filtration on the basis of colors, in JUnit 4 they have test runners. You cannot just take functionality from 2 or 3 test runners simply because in Java such multiple inheritance is prohibited. To have this filtration or additional features, you simply need to steal the code from test runner, which is not good because sooner or later things will not be comparable anymore. In JUnit 5, everything is based on extensions. Extensions are classes that you can flexibly add and take away from a corresponding runner. In the runner itself, you have only a basic logic that you don't want to change. In addition to extensions in JUnit 5, there is a wonderful implementation of parameterization of tests. In JUnit 4, you need to use a separate runner, but in JUnit 5, the logic is already inserted inside of the framework. The tests are not so heavy. You can see an example of the Fibonacci calculation, and you can see the difference even in the number of lines. But we continued to live with JUnit 4. We wrote our own crutches, extensions, filtrations, and whatever, all the things we couldn't live without. But then we found out that for each such crutch, you need to write down additional integration with Allure to write additional connection to Allure, because initially there was no such a logic. It took a lot of time. It was not in vain because we give this framework to external teams, and they can decide themselves what kind of driver they want to use, JUnit 4 or 5, and such customized features might be useful. But for us, we wanted to transit to JUnit 5, and when finally we had a plugin for JUnit 5 for Allure, we started to transit. But we were really surprised when we found out that in JUnit 5 the mechanism of test suits was not implemented. The runner, which was offered by developers of JUnit 5, was based on JUnit 4, so on a test based on JUnit 4 could be started. This functionality was critical for us. We divide our tests into critical, non-critical, regular, non-regular, based on their functionality, and we start them in packages at virtual machines. That way we cannot live without such functionality. What was left we could use only two frameworks simultaneously. JUnit 5 allows to do so. There is a so-called vintage engine. It's a runner which allows you to start JUnit 4 tests even if you work with JUnit 5. We use the following algorithm. The tests, our basic regression tests that we test in packages, written in JUnit 4, and difficult scripts, global smoke tests that we use separately for specific jobs are written in JUnit 5. What are the advantages of our approach? First, we have relation with JUnit 5, we are ready for such a transition. And second, we try to write tests there, which is a good advantage. What are our conclusions? What are the lessons we learned? We need to determine critical functionality. We spoke about ALU, but we have forgotten about Sutrana. So at the very beginning, you need to write down everything you need to for transition, things you cannot live without, and then develop your own expectations. Then you need to monitor new things and to start using the fresh version of framework as soon as possible. In JUnit 5, you can do so. You can use vintage engine, just you did before, but you are completely ready for transition. In summary, I would like to tell you about the main rules you need to apply when you work with a project. First, the test should be written as a regular test. All the internal logics, the check of files and everything should be a part of an additional method. All the technical plugins should be taken out of the test. Only the essence should remain inside. And of course, any changes should be applied to the whole regression in general. This is what we learned from our mistakes. In these 2 years, we have developed an instrument that paid for itself. Our developers create component tests. We use them in our own end-to-end testing. As for now, we have covered 80% of manual regression, 10% of which is non-automatized scenarios. We have not many of them. Then we have 5 external teams that use our instruments. Some of the teams want to use it, and what is more important, we are moving towards open source. Of course, we work in the banking sphere. It's a very difficult process. Nevertheless, we are moving towards open source. There are still some paths leading to open source, and hopefully in the nearest future we will continue our discussion and we'll be able to talk about this instrument in more details. Thank you. Thank you, Liliya. Very interesting presentation. Really useful. I wanted to ask you about test framework. You chose JUnit 4 at the very beginning, and you, as you said, started to create such crutches. Didn't you want to choose test LG, where all the crutches are already there? Then you wouldn't need to transit to JUnit 5. Yeah, I completely agree. I like it more too. But our work was based on statistic data. I came to the project where component tests and unit tests were developed on JUnit. It's hard to force developers to change their mindset. I didn't want to do so. That's why we're based on the technology that they already used in the project, and then added our settings not to damage them too much, because we had to force them to write down pieces of tests anyway. Thank you for your presentation. My question is about a different topic. Do you use QRS server? ALU server? We are waiting for it. Well, 2 days ago, people told me that they were actively using it. We are waiting for it. They told me that it won't be free of charge. You have to pay for it. I don't know, but people told me that they simply moved to it. Well, it's exactly what we need, and we wanted to move there. We wanted first to collect historical data and to create such crutches, but if you say that it already exists, that's really cool. Good afternoon. I see that everything is quite good in Deutsche Bank with testing. I have a question about smart configs. In our team, we use a standard decision we like a split out config. It's very similar to yours. What functionality did you lack in the Spring Cloud config? Why did you want to develop your own decision? Because if you combine a Spring profile with labels, you can get the same functionality. Yes, but we don't use Spring in testing at all, first of all. What I told you is a super short version of Spring. We just took things that we needed for tests from Spring. Why don't we use Spring? Because we wanted to create an easy, low-weight instrument with fewer dependencies, because we use the objects from other projects and we didn't want to have any problems and chaos. That's why we decided to use a low-weight instrument. Terminators and installers were simply stolen from that. You can easily do it, but we don't need the whole functionality of Springs. We needed some pieces. Same with smart config. Even if you don't use Spring, you can connect to it. It's an easy library, easy functions, and you can take the same actions. Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the beginning of your presentation. You said that it's always useful and good to move to a new framework, but everyone understands it's not free of charge and it costs a lot. That's why my question is like that. Deutsche Bank is a banking sphere where everything goes really slowly. How did you manage to convince people to fund this solution? So my question is about how to convince people that you need to do it, because for now it works. Technological load is growing, standard problems, blah blah blah, but it works. Anyway, why do we have to use and invest our resources and money into something that works without it? Yes, thank you for your question. When I came, there was nothing like that. There were two approaches and they were tasks and problems. They shared the problems with me. I can tell you it's difficult to convince people in the banking sphere. You need to come up with good arguments. I told about it last year when we had a conference number 23 in Minsk. The job was difficult. So I motivated them with money. I calculated how much it will cost to fix the problems and how much it will cost to move to another framework. So I had to analyze the current situation, analyze the market, the instruments. I talked about all those things and I managed to convince people on the basis of such an algorithm. But it's not always true. In the previous company, when I tried to use the same terms, I didn't manage to convince people. I decided that it was cheaper to stay with the previous logics. Okay.
But the question out of curiosity, why you're not using coding? I have the same question to the Deutsche Bank. Initially, we thought about the Kotlin, but this tool was not used. Now we use it for Android. A bit later, we started using it for the web. But the mobile app tests have not been written yet. We need to use them for the developers because they're now writing the component test, and now they're using Kotlin. Another question about the versions. For example, at some stage we have a version and tests that work currently in the production cycle, they work on a different version because something has changed. Of course, after the release is no longer important, but to consider it during the transfer stage. We're currently moving towards continuous trimming. If you heard about this, but we have projects said that we're currently stabilizing and controlling. The major work is done before the deploy or the regression test at the UI stand. So you don't have problems with that because we just use mocks to test it before the release. We're out of time, unfortunately. Thank you very much. I promised a T-shirt to this young guy. Thank you very much.